Yeah, hello? I said into the phone, talking to a guy named Gary. I need a quote for mirrored acrylic panels, 1/4 inch thick, UV resistant, about 2,000 square feet. 2,000 square feet? Gary sounded skeptical. What's the application? Trade show display? No, I said. Exterior architectural cladding. Cladding? On a building? On a house, actually. Silence. Then, you gonna cover your house in mirrors, buddy? That's the plan, Gary. Another pause. Huh, okay, never done that before. Gonna be pricey. And you gotta think about expansion, contraction, wind load, installation's tricky. Can you supply the panels? Yeah, we can cut 'em, but installing 'em? You'll need specialists. Facade guys. Not cheap. There are moments in life that feel like pure, unadulterated accomplishment. Finishing a marathon, getting a promotion, finally assembling that IKEA bookshelf without having leftover screws. For me, that moment was standing on my front lawn, hands on my hips, admiring my newly painted house. Not just painted, transformed, resurrected, baptized in the glorious, optimistic glow of sunbeam yellow. For years, my house had slumbered in the same drab, builder-grade taupe as every other house on Maple Lane. It was fine. It was inoffensive. It was soul-crushingly boring. So, after months of saving and weeks of agonizing over swatches, I'd done it. I'd hired painters, ignored the subtle pressure towards grège and agreeable almond, and gone full, unapologetic yellow. And it looked fantastic, cheerful, welcoming. It practically radiated happiness. Standing there, with the late afternoon sun hitting it just right, it was like a giant, friendly buttercup in a sea of beige. My wife, Chloe, came out and stood beside me, slipping her arm through mine. Wow, she breathed. It's even better than the swatch. It actually makes me smile. Right? I grinned, puffing out my chest slightly. No more taupe tyranny for us. We're officially the happiest-looking house on the block. The painters packed up their truck, gave me a thumbs up, and drove off, leaving us to bask in the yellow glow. Life was good. The house looked amazing. What could possibly go wrong? Across the street, behind her perfectly pruned hedges, Beverly adjusted her sprinkler. Even from here, I could feel the disapproval radiating off her, like heat off asphalt. Beverly, our neighborhood's self-appointed minister of muted tones, was not going to like sunbeam yellow. Not one bit. And down the street, nestled in the community clubhouse, clearly visible from my front yard, especially when the afternoon sun hit it, sat the HOA office, blissfully unaware it was about to become collateral damage in the coming color war. It took Beverly precisely 48 hours to make her move. I was out front, attempting to wrestle my recycling bin to the curb, when she materialized at the edge of my driveway, clutching a pair of pruning shears like a weapon. "Benjamin," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, the kind that usually precedes something deeply unpleasant. "Morning, Beverly," I said, trying to sound breezy. "I see the painter's finished," she continued, her eyes scanning my glorious yellow house with an expression usually reserved for discovering mold. It's certainly vibrant. There it was, the opening salvo, vibrant. The kiss of death in Beverly's vocabulary. "Thanks," I said, opting for cheerful obliviousness. "We really love it. Brightens things up, don't you think?" Beverly gave a tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, it's bright, Benjamin. Terribly bright. In fact," she shielded her eyes dramatically, though the sun was behind a cloud at that moment. "The glare, it's quite something, especially in the afternoon. Gives me a dreadful headache just looking at it. The glare. From yellow paint. Right." Sorry to hear that, Beverly, I said, still trying to be polite. Maybe try closing your blinds? Her smile tightened further. It's just not very harmonious, is it? With the neighborhood aesthetic? All the other houses are such lovely, calming earth tones. Yours, rather, shouts. Well, I countered, my politeness starting to fray. Maybe the neighborhood needs a little shouting, a little sunshine. Sunshine is one thing, Benjamin, she sniffed. Being visually assaulted by primary colors is quite another. I do hope it doesn't negatively impact property values. She gave my house one last disapproving look, snipped an imaginary stray leaf off my hedge with her shears, and glided back across the street. I watched her go, my good mood evaporating like dew on a hot sidewalk. Too bright? Visually assaulted? It was yellow paint, for crying out loud. But I knew Beverly. This wasn't just a casual comment. This was the beginning. The official notice arrived a week later, tucked conspicuously under my doormat instead of being mailed like normal correspondence. HOA letterhead. Formal yet passive-aggressive. Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association. Architectural Review Committee. Notice of violation. Aesthetic guidelines. Property 12 Maple Lane, Benjamin Miller. Violation. Exterior paint color. Non-compliance with bylaw. 7.3. Harmonious aesthetics. Dear Mr. Miller, it has been brought to the attention of the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, by concerned residents, read Beverly, that the recent exterior paint application at your property does not comply with established community aesthetic guidelines. Specifically, the chosen color, sunbeam yellow, has been deemed excessively bright and visually discordant with the neighborhood's approved palette. Furthermore, complaints have been received regarding excessive glare, Beverly again, emanating from the property, particularly during afternoon hours, causing discomfort to adjacent homeowners. Pursuant to Bylaw 7.3, which requires exterior finishes to be harmonious and subdued, the ARC finds the current color unacceptable. You are hereby required to submit a plan for repainting the exterior with an ARC-approved color within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $75. You may appeal this decision at the next scheduled HOA board meeting. Sincerely, the ARC HOA Board. Herbert Henderson, President. I read it, my hands shaking slightly. Excessive glare? From matte latex paint, visually discordant? They were actually trying to force me to repaint my entire house because Beverly didn't like yellow. Chloe! I roared, storming into the kitchen where she was making lunch. You will not believe this! Chloe read the letter, her eyes widening. Excessive glare? Are they serious? It's yellow, not chrome. Apparently, in Beverly's world, anything brighter than beige is considered a visual weapon, I fumed. And Henderson signed off on this? Since when is harmonious defined as whatever Beverly likes? You have to appeal this, Ben, Chloe said firmly. This is ridiculous. Oh, I'm appealing, I growled. I'm going to that meeting, and I'm bringing paint swatches, light meter readings, and maybe a strongly worded PowerPoint presentation on the psychological benefits of cheerful colors. They wanted a fight about brightness? Fine, let's talk brightness. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, the very same clubhouse whose windows sat directly in the line of sight from my house, bathing in the late afternoon sun. Irony, thy name is HOA scheduling. The room was depressingly familiar. Beige walls, beige carpet, uncomfortable beige chairs. At the front sat the board. Mr. Henderson, HOA president. A man whose personality perfectly matched the decor. Flanked by two nervous-looking individuals I recognized as Beverly's closest allies on the board, Martha and Stan. Beverly herself was seated prominently in the front row of the audience, clutching a file folder and looking like a plaintiff awaiting a favorable verdict. When my agenda item came up, I approached the table armed with my evidence. Large printouts of my house looking cheerful and non-glary, the original paint can label clearly stating matte finish, and even a printout of the dictionary definition of harmonious. Mr. Henderson, board members, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm here to appeal the violation notice regarding my house color. I believe the claims of excessive brightness and glare are subjective, unfounded, and frankly, ridiculous. Henderson adjusted his glasses. Mr. Miller, the RC received complaints. A complaint, I corrected. From one neighbor, I suspect, who has a personal aversion to the color yellow. Beverly gasped dramatically from the audience. It's not just me. Several neighbors find it jarring. No one else looked particularly jarred. The paint is a standard exterior latex with a matte finish, I continued, holding up the label. It does not produce excessive glare any more than any other light-colored house, and harmonious aesthetics are subjective. My house is well-maintained, and the color is cheerful. It doesn't violate any specific color restrictions outlined in the bylaws because, I paused for effect, there are no specific color restrictions, only vague terms like harmonious. Henderson frowned. The ARC interprets harmonious to mean colors in keeping with the established palette of the neighborhood, Mr. Miller. Your yellow deviates significantly. Beverly stood up from the audience. Mr. Henderson, may I speak? He nodded. That yellow, she declared, pointing a trembling finger in my general direction, is blinding. When the sun hits it in the afternoon, I can barely sit in my own living room. It bounces off his house and directly into my windows. It gives me migraines. Perhaps you could close your blinds, Beverly, I suggested sweetly. I shouldn't have to live in darkness because my neighbor chose an offensive paint color, she retorted. The board members murmured amongst themselves. Martha and Stan looked sympathetic towards Beverly. Henderson cleared his throat. Mr. Miller, while we appreciate your perspective, the board must consider the comfort and cohesion of the entire community. The complaints about glare, combined with the color's deviation from the norm, the board votes to deny your appeal. You have 30 days to submit a plan for repainting. He banged a small beige gavel. I stood there, stunned. They'd actually bought Beverly's ridiculous glare argument. They were forcing me to repaint based on subjective taste and one neighbor's alleged photosensitivity. The injustice burned. As I walked out of the beige clubhouse into the bright afternoon sun, my eyes fell on my cheerful yellow house down the street. Then I looked back at the clubhouse windows, reflecting the sunlight. Glare, huh? They wanted to talk about glare? An idea, terrible and beautiful, began to form. Back home, I stewed. The sheer unfairness of it all was galling. Repaint my beautiful yellow house because Beverly gets migraines from reflected sunlight off matte paint? It was absurd. I sat in my living room staring out the window. The afternoon sun, lower in the sky now, was indeed hitting my yellow walls. And yes, it reflected, like any light-colored surface would. It cast a warm, yellow glow on the lawn. I glanced towards Beverly's house. Yeah, the light probably hit her windows a bit, but blinding? Hardly. Then my gaze drifted down the street towards the community clubhouse. The HOA office windows were directly in the path of that afternoon sun, reflecting off my house. Interesting. If they thought this was glare, what if I really gave them glare? What if, instead of repainting to a dull, HOA-approved shade of beige, I did the opposite? What if I made my house more reflective? Infinitely more reflective? What if I covered it in mirrors? The thought was so audacious, so gloriously passive-aggressive, I almost laughed out loud. They complain about brightness? I'll give them brightness. I'll turn my house into a giant disco ball, reflecting the sun right back in their complaining faces. And if those reflections happen to hit, say, the HOA office windows during meeting times? Purely an unavoidable consequence of complying with the spirit, if not the letter, of their ridiculous complaint. The practicalities, however, were daunting. Could you even put mirrors on the outside of a house? A frantic Google search commenced. Turns out, yes. Architectural mirror panels, often acrylic for safety and weight, were a thing, used occasionally on modern commercial buildings. Expensive? Yes. Difficult to install? Absolutely. Likely to violate a dozen other HOA rules I hadn't even considered? Almost certainly. Perfect. I started sketching, calculating square footage. My two-story house had roughly 2,000 square feet of exterior wall space. That was a lot of mirror. This wouldn't be cheap. This wouldn't be easy. This was certifiably insane. I broached the subject with Chloe that evening, trying to sound casual. "Honey," I said, swirling my wine, "hypothetically, what are your thoughts on mirrored exteriors?" She lowered her book. Mirrored exteriors? Like a building? Like our building, I clarified. Instead of repainting the yellow... Chloe stared at me as if I'd suggested installing a moat filled with sharks. Mirrors? You want to cover our entire house in mirrors? Ben, are you completely insane? What about birds flying into it? What about the glare? Beverly will literally explode. Exactly, I grinned. The glare. She complained about glare, right? This addresses her complaint directly, by maximizing it. And, I added, trying to look innocent, based on the sun's angle, it might just happen to reflect quite brightly onto the HOA office windows around, say, 3 p.m. Chloe's jaw dropped. You wouldn't! They started it, I insisted. They want to police subjective brightness? Fine, let's see how they like living next to a giant solar reflector. She buried her face in her hands. This is going to be a disaster, a very shiny disaster. But when she looked up, there was a spark of horrified amusement in her eyes. Okay, fine, but you are dealing with the contractors and the birds and Beverly's spontaneous combustion. Finding someone to sell me 2,000 square feet of exterior-grade mirrored acrylic panels wasn't easy. Glass companies mostly dealt with windows. Sign companies used thinner stuff. Finally, I found Plastifab Solutions in the industrial park across town. Yeah, hello? I said into the phone, talking to a guy named Gary. I need a quote for mirrored acrylic panels, 1/4-inch thick, UV resistant, about 2,000 square feet. 2,000 square feet? Gary sounded skeptical. What's the application? Trade show display? No, I said. Exterior architectural cladding. Cladding? On a building? On a house, actually. Silence, then. You gonna cover your house in mirrors, buddy? That's the plan, Gary. Another pause. Huh, okay, never done that before. Gonna be pricey, and you gotta think about expansion, contraction, wind load, installation's tricky. Can you supply the panels? Yeah, we can cut them. But installing them? You'll need specialists. Facade guys, not cheap. He was right. Finding installers was the next hurdle. Siding companies laughed. Window companies politely declined. I finally found Apex Architectural Facades, a commercial outfit that usually did office buildings and shopping malls. Their estimator, a sharp woman named Maria, a different Maria, came out to look at the house. She walked around, took measurements, looked at my yellow paint, then back at me. So, she said slowly, tapping her tablet, mirrored acrylic panels on this entire structure. That's right, I confirmed. Any particular reason? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Let's just call it an aggressive response to neighborhood aesthetic feedback, I replied. She actually chuckled. Okay, we can do it. It'll involve custom framing, specialized fasteners, and it will cost. She showed me the preliminary estimate on her tablet, roughly the same as a mid-sized sedan. I swallowed hard. Spite, it turned out, was expensive. Let's do it, I said. The arrival of the Apex Architectural Facades crew and their materials turned Maple Lane into a construction zone. Flatbed trucks delivered crates filled with huge, shimmering mirrored panels. Scaffolding crawled up the sides of my cheerful yellow house like metallic ivy. The neighbors were, predictably, agog. Whispers turned into open gawking. Henderson came out several times, demanding to know what was going on. Beverly watched from behind her curtains, her face pale. The installation process was fascinating and terrifying. The crew, clad in safety harnesses and sunglasses, a necessity, they quickly discovered, carefully drilled frameworks onto my walls, then meticulously mounted the giant mirrored panels. Section by section, the sunbeam yellow vanished, replaced by a flawless, reflective surface. "Never done a house before," Marco, the crew foreman, admitted during a break, wiping sweat from his brow. "Usually just office lobbies or casinos. You sure about this, man? Your neighbors seem twitchy." "They'll adjust," I said, trying to sound confident, watching as another panel went up, reflecting Beverly's twitching curtains right back at her. It took nearly a week of drilling, cutting, and the slow, relentless transformation of my home into something resembling a stealth bomber crossed with a funhouse. The day the scaffolding came down was Moment of Truth, Part 2. The crew packed up, gave me slightly bewildered farewells, and left. Chloe and I stood on the lawn, staring at our house. It was breathtaking and utterly bizarre. It didn't look like a house anymore. It was a shimmering, shifting entity that reflected everything around it: the blue sky, the green trees, the beige houses of our neighbors. From certain angles, it almost disappeared, blending into its surroundings. From other angles, it was a blinding sheet of reflected light. "Well," Chloe said finally, her voice hushed, "it's definitely bright. It's magnificent," I breathed, a thrill mixing with the dawning horror of what I had unleashed. It's architectural anarchy. The real test, however, would come tomorrow. Mid-afternoon, when the sun hit just right. I practically vibrated with anticipation all the next day. I kept checking the clock, checking the angle of the sun. Chloe pretended to work, but kept glancing nervously out the window. Around 2:45 p.m., it began. The sun, moving across the sky, started to hit the large, flat, mirrored surfaces of the west-facing walls. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. My house erupted in light. Not its own light, but the reflected glory of the sun, focused and intensified. Beams of brilliant light shot across the neighborhood. One wide, intense beam struck Beverly's house directly across the street. Her front windows lit up like magnesium flares. I could almost feel the heat from here. Another beam, slightly higher, traveled further down the street. And hit. Dead center. The front windows of the Oakwood Creek Community Clubhouse. Specifically, the windows of the HOA office. They blazed with a white-hot intensity, like the gates of a particularly bureaucratic Valhalla. Almost immediately, Beverly's front door flew open. She stumbled out onto her porch, shielding her eyes, screeching something incoherent. A moment later, the front door of the clubhouse burst open. Mr. Henderson staggered out, blinking rapidly, one hand over his eyes, the other waving furiously in my direction. Oh yes, it was working, better than I could have possibly imagined. What followed was pure, unadulterated suburban chaos. Beverly, temporarily blinded but permanently enraged, stormed across the street, screaming about death rays and retinal damage. Henderson, having recovered his vision enough to navigate, marched down the street, his face puce, yelling about public hazards and weaponized architecture. Neighbors poured out of their houses, drawn by the shouting and the frankly impossible-to-ignore glare emanating from my house. Some shielded their eyes, others just stared, mouths agape. Mrs. Gable was filming again. "Miller!" Henderson bellowed, arriving simultaneously with Beverly at the edge of my lawn. "What is the meaning of this?" "It's my new exterior finish, Mr. Henderson," I said, stepping onto my porch, trying to look innocent. "Mirrored panels. Very modern. Addresses the previous concerns about brightness, wouldn't you say?" "Addresses?" Beverly shrieked. "It's 1,000 times worse. My living room is like the surface of the sun. I can't see. I have spots." "You've blinded the HOA office," Henderson accused, pointing a shaking finger. "Martha can't finish the minutes. Stan spilled coffee on the bylaws. This is an unacceptable nuisance." "Nuisance?" I raised an eyebrow. I thought the issue was my house being too bright and visually discordant. Now it perfectly reflects the harmonious surroundings, including Beverly's lovely beige house and your esteemed office. Isn't that what you wanted? The argument devolved from there. Accusations, threats, Beverly possibly invoking curses, Henderson threatening emergency board meetings and lawsuits. Someone, inevitably, called the police. Guess who? Davies and Rodriguez. They pulled up, took one look at the mirrored house blazing in the afternoon sun, looked at the screaming match ensuing on my lawn, and I swear Officer Davies closed his eyes and counted to 10. All right, Davies shouted over the din, stepping into the fray. "What fresh hell is this?" Explanations were offered, mostly involving shouting and pointing. The officers listened patiently, their expressions shifting from confusion to weary disbelief. "Okay, let me get this straight," Officer Rodriguez said, rubbing his temples after hearing both sides. "He," pointing at me, "painted his house yellow. She," pointing at Beverly, complained it was too bright and caused glare. The HOA, pointing at Henderson, agreed and ordered him to repaint. So instead he covered his house in mirrors, which is now causing significantly more glare, including blinding the HOA office. "That about sums it up," I confirmed cheerfully. "It's a death ray," Beverly insisted. "Is this even legal?" Henderson demanded. Officer Davies sighed. "Honestly, we have no idea. We can check city ordinances for nuisance glare or restrictions on reflective building materials, but I doubt they anticipated this." He looked at my house, then back at the blazing HOA office windows. "Okay, sir," he said to me. "While this is creative, the glare does appear to be a potential hazard, especially if it's interfering with neighbors or, hypothetically, distracting drivers. Luckily, the main glare path missed the street. And covering your house in mirrors might violate other building codes or zoning regs we're not aware of." They took statements. They advised Beverly and Henderson to contact the city zoning department and possibly civil attorneys. They strongly advised me to explore ways to mitigate the glare. Maybe plant some really tall, fast-growing trees? Or reconsider my exterior choices before the city got officially involved. They couldn't force me to take the mirrors down. Not yet, anyway. But the warning was clear. They left, looking like they needed a long vacation. So I became Mirror House Guy. My house was a local curiosity, a minor legend. People drove by slowly. Teenagers posed for distorted selfies. Mail carriers wore sunglasses. Life inside wasn't too weird, but outside was another story. Cleaning became a constant battle against fingerprints, water spots, and contributions. Speaking of birds, they seemed mostly confused, occasionally bumping into the panels, but thankfully no major casualties occurred. The HOA, predictably, went into overdrive. Henderson convened emergency meetings. Lawyers were consulted. They pored over bylaws, searching for any clause, however obscure, that could be used against mirrored cladding. They eventually sent me a notice citing violation of a rule against non-traditional building materials, which was shaky at best. Beverly installed blackout curtains on her front windows and communicated solely through icy glares. The HOA office bought industrial-strength blinds. The intense glare only happened for about an hour each sunny afternoon, but it was enough. The standoff lasted for about 3 months. 3 months of living in a disco ball, 3 months of HOA threats and neighborly side-eye. It was exhausting, and if I'm honest, the novelty had worn off. Cleaning mirrors is tedious. Finally, facing potential legal battles with both the HOA and possibly the city, who were now investigating nuisance glare ordinances, and realizing I couldn't actually see my own house anymore, I called a truce. Or rather, I proposed one. I met with Henderson and a heavily lawyered-up HOA committee. I agreed to remove the mirror panels. In return, they agreed to officially approve a specific, mutually agreed-upon shade of yellow, a slightly less intense, but still undeniably cheerful, lemon zest. They also agreed to revise the vague, harmonious bylaw to include specific, objective criteria in the future. Beverly was not present at the meeting, but Henderson assured me she would abide by the agreement, mostly because her lawyer told her to. Removing the mirrors cost almost as much as installing them. Repainting, again, cost even more. My savings account wept. So the house is yellow again. Lemon zest yellow. It's nice. Cheerful. But it's not quite the defiant sunbeam yellow of before. Beverly still avoids my gaze, but the shrieking has stopped. Henderson gives me curt nods. The HOA office windows are no longer weaponized. Was it worth it? The cost, the hassle, the sheer insanity? Rationally? No. But sometimes rationality isn't the point. Sometimes when someone tells you your sunshine is too bright, you have to respond in kind. You have to reflect their absurdity right back at them, even if it means temporarily turning your house into a giant, blinding mirror ball. And honestly, seeing the look on Henderson's face when the sun hit his office, that memory alone might just be worth the price of admission. At least no one on Maple Lane complains about glare anymore.